I've made it no secret that I love talking about indie games, especially when it's really great, lesser known, or talked about titles that deserve more attention. But let me tell you, it's not often that part of the reason why I think a game deserves more attention is because the soundtrack's just that genuinely incredible. Developed by Moonanagames, Keylocker was crowdfunded via Kickstarter back in 2021 and released just a few weeks ago. And despite its good reviews across the board, it sadly got about as much attention as you'd expect based on what I said a moment ago. So just like usual, I want to convince you to give it a try. Keylocker is a wonderful RPG with music as a main theme in both the story as well as the gameplay. And while the combat does take some inspiration from the Mario and Luigi series with its emphasis on timing for more skill-based gameplay, which I absolutely love as a fan of that series, Keylocker as a whole is a pretty unique experience. It does a lot of cool as well as interesting things with its gameplay, and honestly, it has a surprisingly large amount of replay value partly because of that, and even certain aspects of the story, which, while flawed, has a really creative world and a very charming trio of main characters. So join me while I tell you all about Keylocker, a wonderful music-themed RPG that, fittingly enough, has just an incredible soundtrack. The game takes place on an alternate universe futuristic version of Saturn in a massive human-built habitat of sorts called the Tube. In the present, humanity's long since gone extinct, with doppelgangers, synthetic cybernetic life forms that always come in pairs, taking their place. The doppelgangers, just like every other piece of tech in the Tube, run on electricity, which is generated via the power of music. However, 141 years prior, the government banned people from listening to or making music on their own, with them having full control over the production of electricity. Cut to the present, and we see our protagonist Bobo being taken to prison for playing music for people in the scrapyard zone. After some shenanigans involving her breaking out of prison with her brother Dealer's help, Bobo stumbles upon an old but still functional music-playing jukebot she names Rocket, who she makes the drummer for her band. After Emperor Titan decides to eject her home, the scrapyard zone, from the Tube for reasons I won't get into, Bobo's goal becomes changing the world for the better by defeating the satellites, godlike beings who control the government, and by opening all of the key lockers, music boxes that contain powerful djinn that each hold a piece of a special and very powerful melody. The story of Keylocker at its core is about toppling an oppressive regime through the very literal power of music. And when I say oppressive, I don't mean it's oppressive in just the usual sense. Like I've mentioned that only the government is allowed to produce and distribute electricity for people, you know, the thing doppelgangers need to survive, but they take it a step further. In one of the higher layers of the Tube, Soundwave City, the satellites, in an effort to make sure people can't make their own music, have sealed away everyone's ability to speak with the Keylockers. Yes, they've silenced the masses in the most literal sense possible. Heck, they even reflect the musical silence of Saturnian society in the gameplay. In between the game's intro and the point where you get Rocket, absolutely no music will play at all. In fact, the devs even take this a step further and make it so that every song in the game is completely diegetic, with all of it being music from Rocket that's projected directly into the heads of Bobo and Dealer, with them picking songs based on what's most fitting, which is honestly just the coolest little detail. There are more things I could talk about in this regard, but those are kind of spoilery, so instead, in regards to Keylocker's world, I'll just say that I really like it. There's a lot of ideas here I found super interesting, and I love that Moonanagames took a wildly different direction for the game's cyberpunk setting than what you would expect, with humanity natively being from Saturn. Now, having said that, the writing for Keylocker's pretty good. The game's really charming and even kinda funny outside of the serious moments, like with the save dinosaur, your in-universe explanation for saving, and an entire character who is absolutely adorkable. Honestly, I'd really just recommend talking to everyone and everything in this game. There's really no shortage of fun and endearing side characters or observations, with one of my favorites being one of the 4 currently romanceable characters in the game, Senpai, who's probably about as close to a weeb as you can get in this universe. On the note of the characters, actually, I gotta say I really liked our trio here. Bobo made for a great protagonist in her own right, and certainly wasn't lacking in charm. And the party's jukebot Rocket was kinda precious at points, and for reasons I can't go into, he was honestly just straight up my favorite character in the game. While Bobo's brother Dealer was my least favorite of the 3, I did still really like him, both for his relationship with Bobo as well as his girlfriend Ivy. Dealer and her had a lot of really great moments together, and I find it super cute how he refers to her as Sugar Plum. Now, for as much as I genuinely like the story and its characters though, it does suffer from the only major problem I actually have with Keylocker. See, towards the end of the game, there were at least 2 to 3 times where characters would talk about conversations as well as events that happened totally off-screen, and all of them were important things, with one of them being kinda massive. Really, it just made the storytelling in the latter half of the game a bit hard to follow at points. It in no way ruined my experience at all, but I won't lie, it did make me feel as though there was a couple cutscenes and maybe even a gameplay segment that was cut from the game at the last minute. Having said all of that though, before we move on, I want to go over what I said in the intro about the story factoring into Keylocker's replayability. Honestly, it's in no exaggeration, half of the reason this game has as much as it does, because Keylocker has 4 entirely different endings, and at 20 hours long, it's pretty much the perfect length if you want to go for those different endings. The game also has 4 different post-credit endings based on which of the 4 romanceable character storylines you finish. And to make this even better, there's apparently another 4 on the way that'll be released over the next few updates. Moving on though, I gotta say, presentation-wise, Keylocker looks really good. The game's pixel art on the whole is just great. The animations for combat are all really smooth as well as fluid, and I love the animated intro. It's very beautifully made. Sort of relevant side note, by the way, I want to briefly mention this sprite of a baby elephant happily dancing on a ball, because it's legitimately one of the cutest bits of pixel art I have ever seen, and my life is all the better for it. Now, on the technical side of things, I will say the game was a bit buggy at points, with the only one really worth mentioning from my experience being when some enemies would completely freeze up on their turn for combat and I'd need to restart the fight. This would be super obnoxious if not for the fact that I can immediately restart any fight with just a couple of button presses, so instead it's only kind of annoying. Beyond that though, I never had anything serious at all like crashes occur. It really is just some smaller things. Having said all of that though, we finally get to talk about the soundtrack, and let me tell ya, moonanagames musician Electrobear is very talented, because Jesus Christ, this soundtrack is so good. There's a lot of variety to it, and there were plenty of songs that were really good at adding to the atmosphere for an area. But really, the music as a whole is just great, with some of my favorites being Terrestrial Dystopia and Fenrir's theme, as well as the English versions of Neural Divergence and Desert of the Abyss. Actually, on the note of those songs, I want to first give some praise to the person who sung for Bobo, Samathis. She did a really great job, but I also want to point out how kinda cool it is that the devs literally created an entire fake language for any piece of music Bobo sings. I prefer the English versions to the Saturnian ones, but I respect the love and passion they clearly had for this world to go out of their way to do that instead of writing them in just English and calling it a day. In all honesty though, while I might be underselling this soundtrack some since I'm not exactly great at talking about music, I'm not exaggerating at all when I say that this is genuinely one of my favorite soundtracks this side of Xenoblade 2. I can't recommend giving it a listen enough. Now, there is of course an actual RPG attached to this soundtrack though. Starting with the combat, Keylocker is turn-based with fights taking place on a grid akin to Live Alive, with each character having a set of attacks and abilities that hit or affect a specific number of spaces in a pattern of some kind. This is where we get to some of those cool things Keylocker does I mentioned at the start, because all of your attacks and abilities are based on your equipment. Every character has 4 slots they can equip something in, with those being 2 separate slots for life attack and defense, as well as electric attack and defense, with most weapons and tools having multiple slots they could be equipped to, with that slot determining what they do in battle. Real quick, I actually want to take a moment to explain what I mentioned a second ago about electric attacks, because the game does something kinda cool with this. See, most of the damage from electric attacks will go to the enemy's EP instead of their HP. While your EP can also be used to charge up some attacks or abilities, like anything that generates armor, it also serves as a shield from electric damage, and if your EP is 0, all of that goes right to your health instead. Getting back on track though, just like I mentioned at the start, Keylocker has an emphasis on timing, with every attack and ability having its own action command you'll need to do for better damage or EP restoration. Not gonna lie though, getting the timing down for maximum effect for attacks and such definitely took some practice, cause it can be fairly tricky to figure out at points. Any attack that requires a single button press at the right time will have that character, or enemy if you're blocking, flash white. And while it's definitely helpful, it can sometimes be a little deceiving just because of how tight the timing is for some attacks. I wouldn't personally consider this an issue though. The game is meant to be on the more challenging side of things. As far as I'm concerned, the tighter timing is fitting for me. But hey, if you're wanting something a bit more forgiving or harder altogether, Keylocker's got you covered. On the whole though, I really love what Keylocker does with equipment. Having all of your attacks and other abilities be determined by what you're using and where it's equipped is such a creative idea. It adds so much room for customization with each character. To take this a step further though, the slots themselves can have up to 2 different skill programs equipped to them. Skill programs can be obtained through each character's skill tree, more on that in a moment, and they can do things like cause tile effects, heal, etc. Honestly, this by itself is just a really cool idea, but it works so well with Keylocker's equipment system. Now, having said that, not every character can equip everything though, with that being determined by their class. And now having said that, ladies, gentlemen, and everyone in between, I present to you the other half of this game's replayability. In Keylocker, you'll be able to pick one of 4 classes for each character to play as once you get them, with those being the Juggernaut, Samurai, Hacker, and Sequencer. The only exception to this is Dealer, who starts as a hacker entirely for story reasons. Each class has its own unique skill tree, with nodes that can be unlocked and upgraded by investing a certain number of keys into them that you get from battle and exploration, with every investment leveling up that character. Now, the reason this adds replayability is because each class will actually change the story in some way. If you pick Samurai, my favorite class, you'll partner up with Senpai on the prison break, and even get a weapon you can only get from her. And during Chapter 1, you'll even get a quest from her that's only available as Samurai. If you were to choose Sequencer, you'll instead get Niles and you'll explore a completely different part of the prison, but with him you'll also get multiple unique side quests and you'll have access to the Scrapyard Zone's church, an area you can't visit normally. I can't speak for all of the differences, but you get the idea. Keylocker's class system meaningfully changes certain parts of the game, and I really love that. What makes it better though is that by roughly the halfway point, you actually get to pick a second class to go alongside your first one, with those being Daimyo, Terminator, Cyberwalker, and Attorney, all of which have their own skill trees and changes. And just to clarify, there's not really a bad class for anyone as far as I've seen. You can have Bobo or Rocket use any combination of the two you'd like and you'll be absolutely fine. Now, I unfortunately can't go into depth for the classes themselves at all, since I've only fully played through the game once at the time of writing this, so instead I just want to go ahead and give my thoughts on the combat system as a whole, and obviously I really like it. The Live Alive-esque grid system for combat, combined with the equipment system, skill programs, and the general difficulty, give Keylocker's gameplay so much room for strategy and things to keep in mind when building the party, especially since things like tile effects also harm or apply to allies, such as Entangle, which keeps them from moving. That being said, I do have a couple of smaller criticisms for it. For starters, I'm not the biggest fan of how small the limit on items is. You see, there's a limit to how much you can have of one specific item in your inventory at any time, with the starting limit being 3 for most of them, which, yes, does include healing. While this can be increased over the course of the game and ultimately wasn't too bad to deal with, at least on the normal difficulty, it did make me have to backtrack to a vending machine for healing a good bit, which was honestly a little annoying. Lastly, I kinda wish you could use Dealer more. See, most of the time you'll be using Bobo and Rocket exclusively, and Dealer won't be present in the party for usually story reasons. And this is a problem because you won't be able to level Dealer up while he's not present. Now, thankfully, and oddly enough, him being a much lower level than Bobo wasn't a massive problem at all, but it does mean you'll have to heavily invest in him exclusively until he's caught up. So before we end things off, there are a couple of important minigames I should go over real quick, starting with the one I'm not hot garbage at. See, because the key lockers can't be opened normally without the key Emperor Titan has, Rocket has to go in and hack them open. What plays out is 11 to 17 waves of you fighting enemies as a little sword-wielding Rocket, and on the whole, it's pretty fun. Trying to increase my combo multiplier for better rewards at the end was really fun, and the rewards themselves are pretty worthwhile, with those being money and some stat boosting items. As for the one I'm hot garbage at though, this one's pretty different. Every now and then you'll have to perform a song with Bobo and her band, and what plays out is straight up just Guitar Hero as a minigame, with there being 3 difficulty levels. I've never been good at these things at all, but I do think it is a pretty fitting inclusion, and thankfully you don't really need to be good at all, since honestly, I don't even think you can game over at all during it. That being said though, I do think it's weird that as far as I can tell, there's no way to easily replay any song for fun once you've beaten the game. It's not the biggest deal for me specifically, but if you like this sort of thing, it's kind of a bummer. With Keylocker being the currently lesser-known title it is, I really do hope I've convinced some of you to give this game a shot after all this, because I really do think it deserves more love. It's not perfect, with the story having some issues towards the latter half, but its main cast as well as its charm, and especially the world, do a lot to make up for that. Gameplay-wise, aside from just being a really fun and unique turn-based RPG, its length combined with the multiple endings and romanceable characters as well as the class system give Keylocker a ton of replayability. Like for $20, you can easily get 60 plus hours out of this game. And honestly, do I really need to remind you all about the soundtrack? I'm sure I've made clear how much I love it, and you've been listening to it this whole video. You've heard how good some of these songs are. After playing this, I'm definitely keeping an eye out for all of Moonana's future games, like The Clowned King, which they teased a few weeks ago. And I'll also definitely be looking into playing some of their past games, like Virgo vs. the Zodiac, because if Keylocker was any indication, this is a pretty talented group of devs here. Thank you all for watching, like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and I hope you all have a nice day.